They were not a single regiment, nor a single generation. They were a mixture of regulars, territorials, reservists, and men who had already endured the retreat through Greece. Many were from long-established British infantry battalions, the Royal Scots, the Black Watch, the Yorks and Lancs, the Leicesters, the Royal Marine Detachments, and the gunners of the 52nd Lowland Field Regiment. Others came from support units, signals, engineers, medical corps, supply columns. Few of them had expected Crete to become the defining ordeal of their war. By May 1941, these men were physically depleted and under-equipped. Some had lost rifles or boots in the hurried evacuation from the mainland. Ammunition stocks averaged barely 120 rounds per man. Wireless sets were limited in number and erratic in range. The RAF presence consisted of almost no serviceable fighters. Yet the island, long, mountainous, and exposed to the Aegean, now depended on them. British soldiers arriving from Greece encountered local civilians who had little to offer beyond hospitality and sympathy. Many men slept in olive groves or under hastily strung shelters. The initial impression was deceptive. Crete looked peaceful. Few realized that the island's rugged terrain, lack of air cover, and thinly stretched defensive positions would soon trap them in one of the most violent airborne assaults in history. Ultra-decrypts arriving from Bletchley Park warned of a massive German operation. But intelligence, however accurate, does not alter material deficiencies. The men braced themselves for battle with what they had, not with what they needed. They were about to face the best of the German airborne arm, the Fallschirmjäger, in an operation so ambitious that it would redefine the very doctrine of airborne warfare. And for the majority of the British defenders, the battle was only the beginning. What followed, captivity, forced labour, disease, evasion, or, for the fortunate few, rescue, shaped their lives far more than the firing lines at Maleme or Heraklion. This documentary follows them after the gunfire stops, their march into captivity, their years behind the wire, their survival in the mountains, their return home to an indifferent bureaucracy, and the long shadow Crete cast across the rest of their lives. It is not a story of triumph. It is a story of endurance, of what happened to the men who defended Crete. British soldiers on Crete understood the tactical disadvantage from the outset. They lacked air cover, possessed only partial mobility, and had to defend an island whose terrain simultaneously protected and betrayed them. Crete's ridges, olive terraces, and abrupt gorges broke lines of sight and crippled communications. The number 11 and number 18 wireless sets, already fragile, struggled across the island's jagged contours. Batteries drained quickly under constant use. Within hours of the battle's beginning, entire companies fought blind. At 8 a.m. on the 20th of May 1941, the men witnessed a sight that would etch itself into memory: the low growl of hundreds of Junkers Ju-52 3M aircraft approaching in tight formation. The Ju-52s, powered by 3 BMW 132A radial engines, could carry 12 paratroopers, or 1,800 kilograms of cargo. On that morning, their scale was overwhelming. Nearly 500 aircraft took part in the opening wave, the largest air transport concentration yet committed by the German Luftwaffe. Fallschirmjäger began descending over Maleme, Retimo and Heraklion in staggering numbers. British and New Zealand troops watched parachutes unfold against the morning sun. At ground level, the impact was immediate. Rifle sections that had expected small probes found themselves confronting company-sized drops. The British defenders fought with economy and determination. Bren gunners on Hill 107 fired until barrels glowed. The York and Lancasters at Heraklion held their lines with disciplined fire despite constant Stuka attacks. Married quarters, olive mills and stone-walled terraces became defensive positions. The 52nd Lowland gunners swung their 3.7-inch anti-aircraft guns to horizontal fire, engaging descending parachutists at point-blank range. German casualties were severe. Some zones recorded losses approaching a quarter of their number. In fact, the carnage inflicted on the German paratroopers was so severe that it would alter the course of the war itself. Nearly half of the first-wave paratroops were killed or wounded. Hitler, appalled by the losses, would later forbid large-scale airborne operations, declaring that the day of the paratrooper is over. The Ju-52 fleet was battered during Operation Merkur and never fully replaced. A single 10-day battle ensured that Germany entered the war's later stages with an air transport arm permanently degraded. But on the ground in May 1941, this future strategic victory meant nothing. The weight of numbers compensated for German losses. Communication breakdowns on Hill 107 deprived commanders of situational awareness at the most decisive point of the battle. A local withdrawal, undertaken by exhausted New Zealand companies short of ammunition, was misinterpreted elsewhere as a general pullback. The Germans seized the gap and, by late evening, began landing reinforcements directly onto the contested airfield. Every Ju-52 that survived its landing delivered fresh men, mortars, and machine guns. The defenders, by contrast, had nothing to replace what they expended. Heraklion held out for days, and Retimo even longer. But both positions became irrelevant the moment Maleme shifted firmly into German hands. British and Commonwealth units fell back into the mountains or toward the southern evacuation beaches. The Royal Navy attempted the impossible, evacuating thousands under relentless Luftwaffe attack. Cruiser and destroyer crews steamed into a gauntlet of bombs and machine gun fire. HMS Fiji and HMS Gloucester were lost, demonstrating that naval bravery could not compensate for absent air cover. Roughly 16,000 British and Commonwealth troops escaped Crete. Approximately 12,000 did not. For the trapped battalions, among them the Royal Scots, the Leicesters, the York and Lancasters, the battle was over. But their war was about to take a deeper, more prolonged form. No one marching inland from Sfakia or hiding in the gorges near Platanias could imagine how long their next chapter would run. Some would spend 4 years behind wire. Others would disappear into the mountains. For nearly all of them, Crete was not an ending. It was the threshold of an ordeal that would define the rest of their lives. For the British defenders who failed to reach the evacuation beaches, the moment of capture rarely came with ceremony or clarity. Some surrendered in small groups after exhausting their ammunition. Others were overrun as German units pushed inland. Many were simply cut off in the mountains when the final evacuation orders ended. But once disarmed, the reality became unmistakable. Their war had entered a new, involuntary phase. The initial German priority was movement. Prisoners were driven north across unforgiving terrain toward temporary holding pens near Canea. The distances varied, but many men covered 20 to 25 kilometers per day under rising heat. Most were dehydrated from days of combat. Some still wore torn boots from the retreat through Greece. Others had none at all, having wrapped their feet in cloth or strips of blanket. Guards were not gratuitously cruel, but the orders were precise. Keep the column moving. Stragglers were forced to their feet. Those collapsing often endured rifle prods or shouted commands delivered in a language many did not understand. The holding areas near Canea and Galatas were fields surrounded by makeshift wire. There were no tents, no sanitation facilities, and almost no shade. Water was delivered irregularly and rarely exceeded 2 litres per man per day, wholly insufficient for Crete's climate. Food consisted of hard biscuit and, when available, thin broth. From the island's northern ports, prisoners were eventually loaded onto Greek caiques and military transports for the chaotic journey to the mainland. But the true ordeal began at the rail yards of Salonika. Here, British soldiers came into direct contact with the German 40 and 8 boxcar. Designed for 40 men or 8 horses, these wagons were packed with 60 to 70 prisoners. There was no internal seating. Ventilation came only from 2 narrow slits. Once the sliding doors shut, airflow dropped, and the heat began to rise. The journey to Stalag 8B at Lambsdorff or Stalag 7A at Moosburg typically lasted 7 to 10 days. Inside, daytime temperatures routinely exceeded 40 degrees Celsius. When trains halted, the boxcars trapped heat like furnaces. Condensation ran down the interior walls. Carbon dioxide levels climbed, causing men to faint as the air thinned. Water was scarce. A bucket passed intermittently when guards permitted the doors to open. Men emerged from these wagons with swollen feet, cracked lips, and eyes stinging from days of sweat and poor ventilation. Some collapsed on the platforms, unable to stand after days of near motionless confinement. This disembarkation marked their entry into the German prison camp system. The stalags varied in condition, but all shared a uniform logic: barbed wire, guard towers, dog patrols, and wooden barrack blocks arranged in rows. The British prisoners from Crete arrived here months before the worst privations of the war, yet they were already weakened. The initial medical examination was perfunctory. They were weakened before the long years behind the wire truly began. For most British soldiers captured on Crete, the Stalag was not a temporary interruption, but a new landscape of war, one measured not in miles gained, but in calories, body weight, and labour quotas. The men who arrived at Stalag 8B and Stalag 7A entered captivity already diminished by the retreat through Greece and the boxcar journeys. Many were 10 to 20% under normal weight before a single day behind wire had passed. A hunger war had begun long before they reached the gates. The first hours were clinical. Men were ordered through delousing sheds, stripped of possessions, and herded into barracks where bunks were lined with thin straw mattresses that quickly flattened. Vermin were omnipresent. British medical orderlies attempted rudimentary assessments, noting dehydration, diarrhea, and fungal infections. Food determined everything. German regulations allotted prisoners the lowest ration tier available. A typical day offered little more than a small portion of heavy, dark bread, often padded with sawdust filler, alongside a thin vegetable soup made from turnip or kohlrabi. This amounted to roughly 800 to 1,200 calories a day, far below the 3,000 calories needed to maintain a man performing manual labour. The physiological consequences were stark. Weight fell away with startling speed, faces thinned, eyes hollowed, and muscles shrank. Many men developed edema in their legs, a sign of wet beriberi caused by severe thiamine deficiency. Others exhibited the characteristic skeletal appearance of marasmus. Digestion slowed. Men remained hungry, even while their bodies lacked the strength to move. Disease exploited these weaknesses. Chronic dysentery, often caused by Entomoeba histolytica, ravaged the camps, draining calories faster than food could replace them. Diphtheria appeared in waves, tightening throats and weakening hearts. Antibiotics were almost unheard of. In such an environment, even small wounds risked becoming significant infections. Yet captivity was not confined to the stalags. Most prisoners were sent out to Arbeitskommandos, labour detachments. Some found themselves on farms where conditions were comparatively tolerable. Others were assigned to railway crews. But for many of the men captured on Crete, the harshest fate awaited in the Silesian coal mines. Here, weakened British soldiers were forced to produce between 1.5 and 2 tons of coal per shift. Underground galleries were poorly ventilated and dust-choked. Temperatures swung between cold and clammy. Many miners developed early pneumoconiosis, coughing up blackened sputum after long shifts. Psychologically, captivity became a battle of stasis. Days blended into one another with numbing predictability. Time slowed until it lost meaning. A major and a private stood in the same breadline with the same hollow stomach. Identity shrank to the essentials, surviving the day, preserving dignity, conserving strength. By the end of 1942, the men captured on Crete had settled into a grim rhythm of endurance. Their war had shifted from rifle fire to a slow attrition fought within the body itself. Not every British soldier on Crete marched into captivity. As German lines tightened, several thousand men, cut off from evacuation or separated from their units, found themselves stranded in the island's rugged interior. Some made deliberate decisions to disappear into the mountains rather than surrender. For these men, survival depended not on equipment, but on geography and the willingness of the Cretan people to shoulder immense risk. The White Mountains rose in stark ridges, offering concealment, but little comfort. Evaders slept in caves, shepherd huts, or under rock overhangs. Days burned with Mediterranean heat, nights dropped to near freezing. Uniforms were shredded by the rocks, and boots split within weeks, forcing men to wrap their feet in rags or leather strips scrounged from abandoned harnesses. The single greatest factor sustaining them was the local population. Villagers living under German occupation chose to feed, shelter, and guide British soldiers. They hid men in wine presses, goat pens, and church lofts. Women baked bread covertly. Children acted as lookouts. The Cretans understood the price of resistance. Villages burned, men executed, yet their loyalty rarely wavered. In late 1941, the arrival of the Special Operations Executive changed the landscape of evasion. Officers like Major Tom Dunbabin infiltrated the island to coordinate resistance and arrange evacuations. Communication with Cairo depended on the B-2 suitcase radio set. Weighing over 30 pounds, this device crackled with updates on patrol movements and evacuation requests. The Royal Navy dispatched submarines such as HMS Torbay and HMS Thunderbolt to clandestine beaches along the southern coast. Evacuations were complex, shadowy operations. Submarines surfaced around midnight. Evaders moved under cover of darkness to remote coves, guided by villagers. On lucky nights, small dinghies shuttled groups to the waiting vessels. On others, rough seas or German searchlights forced them back into the shadows. Hundreds of Allied soldiers eventually escaped this way. But the majority remained on the island through 1942 and 1943, living an existence defined by uncertainty. They carried no guarantee of rescue. Supplies dwindled. A few were captured and fed into the Stalag system. Others evaded to the very end. These men fought with patience rather than firepower. Their battle was against hunger, illness, betrayal, and time. Liberation did not come with a dramatic gesture. It came through the slow disintegration of the German war machine in the spring of 1945. Some camps were liberated by Soviet forces, others by Americans. For the men from Crete, the end of the war was less a moment of joy than a signal that the long attrition was finally over. Repatriation fell under Operation Exodus, a vast scheme using Lancaster bombers hastily modified for human cargo. Gun turrets were removed and wooden bench seating bolted into the fuselage. When Crete veterans filed towards these aircraft at liberated airfields like Brussels Melsbrook, they formed a striking contrast with the aircrews receiving them. Many men weighed between 7 and 9 stone after years of caloric deprivation. Their uniforms hung from skeletal frames. Ground personnel noted the silence with which these men boarded. They sat heavily, conserving energy even in the act of lifting themselves onto the benches. Some slept immediately. Others stared ahead, trying to readjust to a world no longer controlled by roll calls. The flights were short, but the sensation of speed and the thrum of Merlin engines felt almost unreal to men who had spent years in the cramped, dark holds of coal wagons. Upon arrival in England, jubilation was an emotion few could summon. The men passed through reception centres where military medical officers conducted systematic evaluations. The doctors did not need charts to see the damage. The cumulative toll of the Stalags was written on the men's bodies. Years of vitamin deficiency and malnutrition had left them with widespread neuropathy, numbness and weakness in the limbs. Hearts beat with irregular rhythms linked to beriberi. Lungs were scarred from coal dust. Their war had been as physiological as it was military. This physical reality soon collided with the bureaucracy of peace. The Ministry of Pensions demanded clear documentation of injury or illness, yet few POWs possessed the meticulous medical records necessary to substantiate claims. Captivity had blurred timelines and reduced complex illnesses to terse German notations. As a consequence, fewer than 30% of POW-related disability claims were approved on first submission. The men returned to a Britain reshaped by scarcity. Rationing persisted, housing shortages strained families. Reintegration was not simple. A fitter who had spent 4 years in captivity might find that machinery he once knew had been replaced. A miner who had laboured under coercion in Silesia might be physically incapable of returning to a British colliery. Family reunions were complicated by absence. Children had grown into teenagers. Wives had managed households alone for years. Communication during captivity had been limited to sporadic letters, so the men returned to domestic landscapes that felt strangely altered. Most did not speak at length about their experience. The British cultural instinct toward understatement encouraged quiet rather than testimony. The war ended in 1945, but the effects of Crete did not. For the men who had defended the island, the battle marked only the beginning of a set of consequences that followed them through middle age and into the final years of their lives. Little about Crete remained visible on the surface. It was not memorialized with the same fervor as Tobruk or Arnhem. Its survivors re-entered post-war Britain without public recognition or distinct status. Yet privately, the legacy of the island shaped their daily existence in ways that were profound and lasting. The most enduring legacy was the quiet sickness. The extreme weight loss of the camps was often regained, but the underlying damage remained. The ailments they brought home, the breathless chests, the trembling hands, the digestive systems that never quite settled, did not vanish with good food. They became permanent silent house guests. This invisible damage materially limited their working lives. Younger men, who had entered captivity in their early 20s, found the labour market unforgiving. A carpenter who had not touched a tool for 4 years returned to workshops transformed by mechanization. A labourer weakened by captivity found himself passed over for fitter candidates. The labour market had little time for sympathy, and the pension system often refused to acknowledge that a man's inability to lift heavy loads in 1950 was directly linked to the starvation rations of 1942. Family life bore the weight of this legacy as well. The men came home changed in ways their families found difficult to articulate. Their wartime experience did not announce itself in dramatic outbursts, but in small, persistent habits. They ate hurriedly, finishing plates even when full, driven by a muscle memory of starvation. Some slept lightly or woke suddenly. Others disliked crowds or closed spaces. Wives who had spent years as the sole heads of households were expected to return to older patterns of dependence, while husbands struggled to reassert authority they no longer felt they possessed. In the 1940s and 1950s, psychological terminology was rudimentary. What we might now call trauma or hypervigilance was interpreted simply as a difficult temperament. The British desire to move forward left little space for reflection. The men absorbed this expectation. They had survived a harsh ordeal. They now preferred to work, raise families, and avoid unnecessary conversation about the past. But memory is rarely obedient. Many found themselves replaying scenes from Crete or the Stalags decades later, fragments of the airborne assault, the boxcar journeys, the faces of friends who had not returned. Because Crete was a defeat followed by captivity, it lacked the celebrated narrative of Normandy or El Alamein. Britain had no structured public story for these men. As a result, they formed their own quiet networks of resilience. Reunions in the 1950s and 1960s took place in pubs or regimental halls. Here, men who had once stood together in olive groves now compared pension ratings and workplace injuries. They spoke practically about rations, labour details, and the mechanics of survival. It was the kind of oral history that rarely reached official archives but formed the true legacy of their war. Crete has never occupied the same place in British public memory as Dunkirk or Arnhem. It lacked the symbolism of resilience or the finality of liberation. It ended in retreat and capture, and the men who fought it disappeared into the shadows. Yet the question of what happened to the men who defended Crete cannot be answered in a single image. It must be answered in stages just as they lived it. They fought a violent, confusing battle against an enemy enjoying absolute air superiority. When defeat came, they endured the humiliation of surrender, the brutality of forced marches, and the terror of the boxcars. They laboured in mines and on farms under conditions that eroded their bodies day by day. They lived in the mountains as evaders, relying on the courage of strangers. When they finally returned home, they did not find a world that understood their sacrifice. They found a bureaucracy that questioned their injuries and a society that wanted to forget the war. They aged faster than their peers. Many died younger, and yet they carried on. They rebuilt their lives with a stoicism that reflected not indifference, but a deeply ingrained understanding of their era. They had done their duty in Crete as best they could with the means available. Their legacy lies not in a decisive military outcome, but in the endurance of the human spirit. Their lives after the battle reveal a truth often overlooked in accounts of warfare, that the consequences of defeat are lived not just in the moment of surrender, but in every year that follows, in the body, in the home, and in the quiet spaces of memory. These men were ordinary soldiers placed in extraordinary circumstances, outgunned, under-supported, and ultimately overwhelmed. But what happened to them afterwards, how they survived, adapted, and bore their experience into old age, is the true measure of their story. Their battle lasted 10 days. Its shadow lasted a lifetime. This, finally, is the answer to the question. What happened to the men who defended Crete? They endured, they suffered, they survived. And although history has not always remembered them with the prominence they deserve, their legacy lives on. A testament to men whose war did not end when the island fell, but only many years later, when their bodies and memories at last laid down their burdens.